Hi, and thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Little Princesses by Marion Crawford. In this chapter, we see how they're sort of growing into their role. I guess they really didn't have much choice, but they are rising to the occasion. Also, they take their first sort of official holiday to Balmoral as the royal family. And it's fascinating because I hear descriptions of Balmoral that I've never heard before. So let's get on so you can share it too. So this chapter is called Royal Occasions. Just before we get stuck in, can you like and subscribe if you like the book readings? It really helps me. Okay, here we go. In the early months of his rule, the king appeared to me to grow taller, though I don't suppose he really did. It was an astonishing experience to see this very youthful person who had always been so self-effacing and delicate, one of the family, come into his own. Lilibet and Margaret left for Scotland for the holiday they looked forward to all year round, but this time it was different because instead of being at Birk Hall, they were the royal family, so they went to Balmoral Castle itself. The castle stands in the wonderful Dee Valley, surrounded by famous grouse moors and hills that were planted with Scottish firs by order of Queen Victoria. It was an ancient baronial castle with a keep and many towers with winding stairways and small unhandy rooms, difficult to furnish. I love all the history about Balmoral. I love the fact that, it was Queen Victoria's happiest place. The drawing room and dining room had been modernised by the King and Queen, but upstairs everything was pretty much as Queen Victoria left it. Tartan linoleum, tartan curtains, and bedroom china of the old-fashioned basin and jug type, and even little hair tidies made of tartan hanging on all the dressing room mirrors. In the drawing room at Balmoral, there's a collection, a painting of heads of past gillies or hunting servants. A full-size statue of the Prince Consort, Prince Albert, stands forever in the front hall with a patient and slightly martyred expression, as though he was getting a little tired of waiting around. Everyone loves to go to Balmoral. The staff bedrooms are all up on top of the castle looking over the hills. The men on one side, the women carefully segregated on the other. Another relic of the Victorian regime. I wonder how many to and froing went. How many crushes and holiday romances ensued on these holidays. It is very quiet all winter up there in the hills, but with the arrival of the royal family, the whole countryside comes to life again. The little church of Crawfie is packed every Sunday, and a great outburst of social life succeeds the empty months of winter and spring. Now this is really interesting. It's about the stags. And of course the stags are so much a part of Balmoral. Of course the hunting of the stags. We saw that in The Crown, didn't we? I felt quite sorry for the stag. But also it's just such a part of that view of the hills, seeing the stags in season. When October came, we could hear the stags roaring in the hills. Sometimes from far away we watched them fighting. We were always horrified at the faithfulness of the females who stood meekly around to see who won the fight and then lined up behind the winner. No one, it seemed, ever stood by the poor stag who'd been vanquished and cast out. Meals were simple but substantial. Everyone ate more because of the cold. Tea, a meal for which Scotland has always been famous, became one of the high spots of our day. There would be shrimps. Now this sounds a little bit Enid Blyton, I think. Shrimps and hot sausage rolls, scones, and those various sorts of griddle cakes known in Scotland as baps. This meal was laid out on a table in the dining room where everyone automatically collected as soon as the men who had been out with the guns came down from the moors. At night, after dinner, 7 pipers in their kilts and sporrans would walk, playing through the hall and the dining room. Lilibet and Margaret loved this nightly ceremony and were usually waiting to peep over the stairs at the 7 pipers go by. They looked down on top of them. There was a regiment on guard at the castle, but they were not too obvious. The young officers loved to play sardines, musical chairs, or hide-and-seek with the children, and later came in very handy for dances and other games. One annual function was the Gillies Ball. Yearly this was given for the king's outdoor staff and their wives and families. Now, when everything was sort of updated in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, late 50s, after the Second World War, it's interesting that that guard at Balmoral was actually removed because the powers that be were quite horrified that the army were being used to sort of move the royal family into the castle and were used to entertain people and were, used for games and all that sort of thing, and then were used to move them back out of the castle. And they said this wasn't really a good use of their armed forces, so a stop was put to that. But I could imagine that they would be able to, with all the rising tensions and World War II looming, I guess they could excuse the fact that a garrison needed to be on guard at Balmoral Castle. When Lilibet was 12, she was allowed to come down for a little while for the very first time and take part in some of the reels. She did not wear any special frock, just a little girl party dress. You can see the late Queen's love of Balmoral, how it stemmed from her childhood, can't you? The way she loved her personal piper at Balmoral, and she loved the Gillies Ball, and she loved dancing to reels, and she loved the games at Balmoral. So you can just see it stemmed from that childhood fun. Lilibet was far more strictly disciplined than Margaret ever was. Oh, we're not surprised, are we? Margaret was having quite a lot of social life from the age of 10 onwards, so she was a little precocious. But the king set a very high standard for Lilibet because she was the heir to the throne. The king had great pride in her, and she had an inborn desire to do what was expected of her. Oh, she was a good one, wasn't she? The late Queen. She was just fit for purpose, perfect for the role. It was now the dress was to become for me a very serious problem. I would have to make my budget last, and my year's outfits had to be planned. Because, she was in court, often in mourning. She would have to come up for morning dress. And Crawfie actually makes the point that in Edward VII's time, the palace staff got all their mourning provided. But this convenient arrangement had elapsed before I got there. So she had to not only equip herself for balls and splendid parties and state occasions, she had to equip herself for mourning. And it was chewing up all her wage. There were now balls and splendid parties, and the wardrobe that had been adequate at 145 Piccadilly no longer sufficed. I can still remember the thrill of my first state ball and the frantic preparations I made for it. I had a Saxe blue velvet dress with a wide skirt and simple bodice, and a cluster of artificial roses of all shades, which cost me a fortune. Now, when she put this grand outfit on for her first state occasion, it was Margaret that came to check her out. "Oh, Crawfie," she said, "you look lovely. Are you excited?" Indeed, I was. For many years before balls or courts or parties, Margaret would come to my room like this, I admiring her, she admiring me. But this special evening had always remained with me because it was the first, and it was made quite perfect for me because the king himself asked me to dance. Lilibet was bridesmaid for the first time to her uncle, the Duke of Kent, and his beautiful young wife. He was the best looking of all the princes, and they certainly made a glamorous couple. Marina was a fairy story princess come to life, and I'll never forget how lovely I thought her when I first saw her. Of course, the Duke of Kent was tragically killed in that airplane crash, and, this beautiful young couple, and their son was only 7 weeks old when he died in that crash. So it's quite lovely to hear about the very beautiful Princess Marina, but you also feel the tragedy about to come. It was about this time that a young man first appeared on the scene from time to time. I remember this was Mr. Normal Hartnell, whom we all came to know quite well. In those days he was young and slim and perhaps a little intense. That's a polite way of saying terribly gay, I would imagine. He fitted Lilibet's bridesmaid's frock for the Kent wedding and stood back to admire the general effect, one hand on his hip. I'm sure it was, darling. Margaret, then a small girl, was immensely intrigued by him. Mr. Hartnell has made most of the Queen's clothes ever since. It was he who designed Lilibet's very beautiful wedding dress. It was beautiful too. I suggested one day that it would be a very good idea for the children to start a Girl Guide company at the palace. Besides keeping them in touch with the children of their own ages, I knew it would bring them into contact with others, and also from all backgrounds, from all kinds and conditions, Crawfie said. So they got hold of Miss Violet Singe, who was the Guide Commissioner for all of England, as you do. How could it ever answer, Miss Singe said. Guides must all treat one another like sisters. I had some difficulty in persuading her that there was nothing that Lilibet and Margaret would like better than to be treated like ordinary children, like sisters, for in those days they were quite ready to take the whole world to their hearts. It makes you wonder what happened to Margaret, doesn't it? Honestly, I think it was just booze. I think that she was the classic alcoholic. She was the classic person that couldn't handle her drink. And I think it made her moody and nasty and altered her mood. I think if she'd never had an alcoholic drink, she probably would have had a really, really happy life. So Miss Singe came to tea. She found two polite and very enthusiastic young girls. One difficulty was that Margaret was too young to be a guide. This bothered Lilibet immensely. You don't think we could get her in somehow? She said to Miss Singe. So persuasive was Lilibet that in the end we got around the difficulty by arranging for 2 brownies to be attached to the palace guides and making Margaret one of the 2 brownies. We had 20 guides and 14 brownies drawn from the children of court officials eventually. Once it became really, really popular, that's how much it grew. And these were all children from palace employees. King George's summer house in the garden came in most handy as the headquarters. They had to put a stop to the fact that many children were so excited to come to the palace that they would wear their party frocks, white gloves, and be accompanied by their nannies and governesses, obviously the aristocratic young children that joined. So they quickly put a stop to that. There was one guide game we played where all the shoes are heaped together in the middle of the room and their owners have to find their own and put them on and see who can get back to the starting line first. This never went very well, as quite half the children did not know their own shoes. Lilibet and Margaret told me this with scorn later. There was never any nonsense of that kind in their nursery. It mustn't be overlooked that for some time after the accession there was still a chance that one day there might come along a brother for Margaret and Lilibet. Now, I've never heard that before because I always heard that, basically it wasn't an intimate relationship between the king and the queen and that it was really in vitro, an early version of in vitro fertilization that brought about the 2 princesses. But evidently people thought that there might be a brother that may come along, in which case the queen could have had her life that she always wanted of, just racehorses and all that sort of thing. But then Crawfie says, was this a disappointment to the King and Queen? I never knew. But Lilibet would, of course, one day be queen, so we felt her education should proceed on a wider lines than before. Now, the Queen spoke to Sir Jasper Ridley about this one day, and she told him that she would like Sir Henry Martin to take Princess Elizabeth in constitutional history. Now, of course, he was at Eton College, so Crawfie would take her twice a week to Sir Henry at Eton until the war started, when he came to Windsor Castle. We went over to Eton College and they took place in his study. Lilibet had been a little overawed at the prospect and she clung to my arm as we went up the stairs. In the study there wasn't a chair to sit on. Books were everywhere. Piles of books stood like stalagmites on the floor. "Crawfie, do you mean to tell me he's read them all?" Lilibet gasped. Then the door opened and he came in and shook hands with her in a most courteous fashion, at once making her feel very grown up and important. Lilibet, who'd always been very shy, felt entirely at home with him, and there was a real and rather charming friendship between the little girl and the old scholar. I sat in the window during the lessons. "Would you like a book to read, Miss Crawford?" said Sir Henry. So that was lovely. That was lovely that she was pretty good at the old constitutional history in the end. Then she talks about the fact that it was springtime and the country just looked absolutely beautiful. Now, the king actually got a little bit ill, so they ended up being advised by their medical professionals to go to the seaside. And they just thought it was so much fun. The king and queen enjoyed this unexpected spell of freedom. They took us out from time to time for the greatest treat of all, tea in a hotel. It was usually served upstairs in a private room, otherwise it would have all the crowds gathering around the hotel. The little girls rode ponies on the sands, and we built sand castles and collected shells. In the evenings, the king and queen would walk together in the beautiful garden, arm in arm. It was so pleasant to see them together. They were still very much in love. The king, when he was alone with his family, was boyish and full of fun. One day, when we were at Eastbourne, he very solemnly handed me a matchbox. "It's a present for you, Crawfie," he said. I opened it with interest and found it contained my pet abomination, green sandworms. At one time, I got quite anxious about Lilibet and her fads. She became almost too methodical and tidy. She would hop out of her bed several times a night to get her shoes quite straight, her clothes arranged just so. We soon laughed her out of this, though. I remember one hilarious session we had with Margaret imitating her sister going to bed. It was not the first occasion or the last on which Margaret's gift of caricature came in very handy. So obviously anxious and maybe had some form of OCD, and they basically jollied her out of it, laughed her out of it, which I guess happened to ease her anxiety, which is marvellous really, isn't it? Meanwhile, there were garden parties to which the little girls now began to go with Mummy and Papa. For those occasions they wore very simple afternoon frocks, usually of silk, often hand-smocked quite short with knickers to match, and straw hats and white cotton socks. And they would talk about Queen Mary being such a popular figure at these garden parties, and they would make their way through to the crowd, and there would be a royal enclosure sort of at the back, and Lilibet and Margaret would, say hello to everyone very politely, but they would be in a rush to join Queen Mary at the royal enclosure because that was where the tea was, so they would get hold of all the cakes. The first time Lilibet and Philip appeared in public together was at one of these parties, where, like any other newly engaged girl, Lilibet went around proudly showing her new engagement ring. At the last garden party where my husband and I attended, this is before Crawfie was excommunicated, the chief figure around whom everyone flocked and who got the royal welcome of the day was not a member of the family at all. It was Winston Churchill. He came down the steps from the ballroom into the garden to find a royal reception waiting for him. A path had been cleared for him through the crowds, and everyone clapped and fought to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. So this grand old warrior made his way over the garden to have tea with the king. At 6 o'clock, a gentle hint that it was time to go home was given when the band played the national anthem. The family would form a procession and go back to the palace. I remember being very amused once hearing Lilibet instruct Margaret before they went down to one of the garden parties and how she should behave. "And if you do see someone with a funny hat, Margaret, you must not point at it and laugh at it," she told her sister solemnly, "and you must not be in too much of a hurry to get through the crowds to the tea table. That's not polite either." Now, I wonder whether Lilibet actually drove Margaret to drink later. She seems like a bit of a goody two-shoes, but thank goodness she was, because that was just what was needed after Uncle David. The main event of the London season had always been the courts at which the year's debutantes would be presented to the King and Queen. This was far more formal than the garden parties, and not anyone could get into this. You had to be someone, connected to aristocracy. You had to be introduced to the court. Not anyone could get in. Of course, Princess Margaret was rather damning of it in later years. I think it was in the early 60s where pretty much anyone could get in to be presented as a debutante. And then it just sort of, everyone lost interest in it at that point because the great unwashed was allowed in. Official dress was always worn at the courts. This gives to the whole evening an air of glamour. The men wore knee breeches and silk stockings, tailored coats and medals and orders. The women wore full evening dress and 5-foot trains. In their hair they have 3 curled ostrich feathers and a long veil hanging down behind. The king and queen, wearing their crowns and very beautiful jewels, sit side by side on 2 thrones, and the other members of the family present group behind them with their equerries and ladies in waiting. There was always a feeling of great excitement at the palace on the night of court. The little girls in their dressing gowns used to peep through the windows at the crowds of cars, the beautiful ladies and the gentlemen at arms, wearing their plumed hats, arriving. "We have a fly's eye view," Lilibet said. We always say bird's eye view, don't we? It's a fly's eye view. We always waited with great excitement to see what Aunt Marina, the Duchess of Kent, would be wearing, for she was always one of the loveliest of them all. "When I grow up," Margaret said, "I shall dress like Aunt Marina does." She told me that one day when she was about 10, and it's a promise she has tried hard to keep. Indeed, the young Margaret was so beautiful and so well dressed, she was movie star material. The Duchess had 3 children: Prince Edward, the present Duke of Kent, a schoolboy at Eton, Princess Alexandra at boarding school in Ascot, and Prince Michael, her youngest. He was 7 weeks old when his father was killed. She always bathed the baby herself. I used to go over and watch her sometimes and think what a pretty picture she made with the little boy. Prince Philip is her cousin, and they both have the clean-cut Viking look. It was always a little difficult to get the princesses to bed on these court nights, for it was long before midnight before the last car started up and the last coach clattered out of the courtyard and silence fell. In the spring of 1939, the King and Queen went to Canada and the United States, and we all know why, don't we? We were trying to get, the United States involved in the war because, of course, Germany was looming. The Queen always has to take a great deal of luggage on these official trips. Dozens of evening frocks are necessary to cope with the differing climates and places in which she would appear. All of these were packed by her maids, who were known as dressers. They have complete charge of her whole wardrobe. She must take hats, bags, gloves, shoes for every outfit. Queen Mary took the children down to Portsmouth for the final goodbyes. I think the King and Queen felt the parting more than the children did. They were enchanted by the train journey and seeing the ships. If you've got this book, I encourage you to, of course, read this, because I'm leaving out very large sections. I'm just sharing highlights that I think everyone will be really, really interested in. But there's a lot of background to this that is really quite beautiful and really paints the picture. One day there was great excitement. We had a call on the transatlantic telephone. The voices of the King and Queen came through so clearly they might have been in the next room. We ended the conversation by holding the Queen's corgi Dookie up and making him bark down the telephone by pinching his behind. Poor Dookie. He was devoted to the Queen, and she says, poor Dookie. But he was very sour-natured otherwise. I don't blame him. Would you want to be held up to this strange contraption and have your bottom pinched to make you bark? I don't think so. No wonder he was irritable. Meanwhile, Queen Mary kept her eye on us as she had promised to do. She was one of the kindest, most considerate of people, and it is not for nothing that most of the staff in her employ had been there all their lives and grown old with her. She frequently took the children off her hands to give you a bit of a rest, Crawfie. So she took them to art galleries in the Bank of England and to the Royal Mint, and they saw the King's new seal. Actually, someone in my comments said to me that they got, I think it was a $2 coin with the King's head on it, which is amazing. David and Michael Bowes-Lyon, the children's uncles, were very kind at this time and took the children off for weekends with them. I did not go because I thought a little rest would be nice for me. We had hundreds of letters and snapshots from all sorts of people in Canada and the United States. And you know why they sent them? They wanted the little princesses to know that their parents were all right. And if they spotted them, they used to send them, little postcards saying, I saw your mother and father, they look fine. And it was a wonderful experience for the little princesses because they realised just how lovely people were all around the world, and they had a really good feeling about it. So that's lovely. That was back in the day when we all got on and it was all lovely. And other than the Second World War, I suppose that's an ignorant comment, but the UK and the United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand all got on back then. It was a lovely time. Now, the king caused a lot of mirth and amusement because he was saying by writing on a postcard that he'd eaten hot dogs, and the princesses had never heard of that before. Now, the little girls anticipated their mother and father coming back, so they spring cleaned the little house at Royal Lodge. I remember from top to bottom, they shook all the mats, brushed the carpets and prepared for the homecoming of Mummy and Papa, just as the staff were doing at the palace. The return was a great event in the children's lives. We got up very early in the morning. Lilibet and Margaret had grown enormously during their parents' absence. I think it was over 6 months. There were 4 of us, the children, Ala and myself, and we went to Southampton on the train. The children had their comics to read, and people were awfully nice about them going to meet their parents. There were much bigger crowds there for the homecoming at the station, waving at the carriage. When we got to Southampton, we had to get on a destroyer to go out to the middle of the channel to meet the Empress of Britain. Then the Empress of Britain came into sight and we went below to tidy ourselves. The captain's cabin amused us with its primitive amenities. There were photographs of children and a dignified-looking wife. Then these 2 figures, waiting with great eagerness, looked down the stairs as they mounted the Empress of Britain. The little girls could hardly walk up the ladder quickly enough, for climbing was very awkward. But when they reached the top, they rushed to Mummy and Papa. They kissed them and hugged them again and again. Everybody else kept them out of the way, and I hesitated halfway up the gangway too. It was a very joyful reunion indeed. And that's what I can't understand, because when they met their mother and father, who were king and queen, there was really warm embraces and, hugs and kisses like Crawfie said. Yet when the queen met the young Princess Anne and Prince Charles, she just shook their hand. And she was quite remote. And yet she grew up with those lovely bear hugs and enormous warmth and welcome. Then I went up and curtsies, and they seemed very pleased to see me. The Queen kissed me and said how much the children had grown and how well they looked. And all the time the King could hardly keep his eyes off Lilibet. I have a photograph which shows the Queen very slim, holding Margaret's hand, wearing her favourite blue, with grey shoes and stockings and handbag, and the King looking at Lilibet. Margaret, during the period of the Canada-America trip, had begun to thin down a little. Well, thank goodness for that. She just clung to Mummy's hand, glad to have her back again. She made us all laugh by saying, "Look, Mummy, I'm in quite good shape now, not like a football like I used to be." We had lunch in the ship's dining room, and they'd hung up streamers and balloons, and the girls were just so excited. And in the exuberance of the moment, Crawfie drank a champagne cocktail, a thing I seldom do, and it had the most odd effect on me. I suddenly felt very untrustful of my knees, and all the noise seemed suddenly to be coming from a very long way off. The Queen gave me a sympathetic glance and laughed. "Poor Crawfie," she said, "I ought to have warned you. They make them rather strong aboard." Poor Crawfie, I know the feeling. Back at the palace, we had the usual crowds and balcony appearances, this time enjoyed by everyone rather more than usual. It had been so long since the King and Queen had been home among their own people. The children went late to bed that night. There were so many parcels to open, so many tales to tell. People from all over the States and Canada had sent presents to their little girls. Among the things that delighted them most were some frilly American pinafores sent by some children out west, and some small totem poles about a foot high. They were quaintly carved and coloured, Indian fashion. They had them on the mantel shelf in their room for years. And that's the end of the chapter. Next Friday night will be chapter 6, The Outbreak of War. I hope you will join me then for another chapter of this brilliant book. I don't want it to end. We're about halfway through, so we've got halfway to go. I'll see you then. Bye.